good to be with you all tonight to share and talk about something other than COVID-19. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us in reviewing the results of this research from Cardis and the University of Notre Dame. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items that we need to review up front. We are recording this presentation, and we hope to make it available to you shortly after this evening. So if you get disconnected, or if you'd like to share this with someone in the future, you should be able to do so as long as the technology works out on our end. The formal presentation is expected to take approximately 45 minutes in length, followed by a Q&A session. You may submit questions through the chat throughout the presentation, and then we will work to answer them as best we can at the end. Throughout the presentation this evening, I am going to be referring to both classical education and classical Christian education. For the purposes of this presentation this evening, these terms are going to be used interchangeably. And when I refer to classical Christian education, I am referring to classical Christian education in the Protestant tradition. The classical movement more broadly has gained traction over the past 3 decades, and there are many secular and Catholic schools who are also employing a classical pedagogy. We are not reviewing them this evening. And so again, our focus tonight is going to be on classical Christian education in the Protestant tradition. Thank you again for coming. If you would, I'd like to ask that you join me in a word of prayer as we open our evening together. Dear Lord, we come to you in prayer now. We thank you for this day. We thank you for the rain that you've blessed us with here in Pottstown this evening, Lord. Lord, as we gather together, we are mindful that our nation is in the midst of a health and economic and increasingly racial crisis. And Lord, this evening we want to ask a special prayer upon those in Minneapolis and in any other cities that are in turmoil this evening, that you would bring peace to those demonstrators, that you would bring justice to those who have been wronged. Lord, we ask that you would bless our nation, bless our leaders, help them to unite us, to calm us, to lead us in a way that would be honoring to you. Lord, as we talk this evening about classical Christian education, I ask that you would bless the presentation that I am about to give, that you would bless my words with clarity, and that Lord, that you would help us all as we seek out the best possible ways to educate our children. Lord, we thank you so much for your Son, Jesus Christ, for the forgiveness that we have through him, and we thank you so much for that. And it is in Jesus Christ that we pray all these things. Amen. Okay, so over the next 40 to 60 minutes, we are going to explore 3 different items, and I'm going to try my best to keep these things separate and distinct. First, we are going to look at some of the research results from the study conducted by Cardis and by the University of Notre Dame. Second, I will share some theories with you on why classical Christian education that it does in these studies. And then third, I'm going to spend a few moments looking at what we are doing here at Coventry Christian Schools in our own delivery of a classical Christian education. So let's dive into this study. The first task, as I've mentioned, is to review the results from a Good Soil, a comparative study of ACCS alumni life outcomes. I will be referencing and quoting directly from the Good Soil report, as well as the Cardis Educational Survey. And it is important that we pause at the outset and give credit to whom credit is due. So I'd like to thank the Association of Classical Christian Schools, Cardis Education Survey, Mr. David Goodwin, who is the president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools, Dr. David Sickink from the University of Notre Dame's Sociology Department, the Classical Difference, and to all those who participated in both the Cardis and ACCS surveys. I will not be citing each item individually throughout this presentation, but these individuals, their teams, and their organizations have done tremendous work in compiling and analyzing this data. At the end of the presentation, we will send you links to these groups and their work so that you can see it for yourselves. In 2011, Cardis launched an educational survey to look at the various impacts of education on life outcomes. The Cardis Education Survey is recognized as one of the most comprehensive and valuable surveys of its kind. Cardis has conducted its educational survey in 2011, 2014, and again in 2018. In 2018, the Association of Classical Christian Schools contacted the researchers involved with the 2018 Cardis study in order to sponsor a parallel survey of ACCS alumni. They used the same questions and data collection methods as the broader Cardis survey. Those ACCS results were then appended to the Cardis results in order to provide a true comparison of ACCS alumni to the results of the other school segments which were studied. The study on life outcomes that we are reviewing tonight show the comparative life outcomes of alumni who are in their early 20s through their early 40s and who attended and then graduated from a variety of schools. The individuals are grouped into 6 segments based on the type of school the alumni attended. Those segments are public schools, non-religious private schools, which are typically the high academic preparatory schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools, which are generally affiliated with an evangelical school association, religious home schools, and finally ACCS schools, or classical Christian schools. The measurable life outcomes of alumni from these various school backgrounds reveal that there is a very significant impact based on the type of K-12 school the person had attended. In the 7 life profiles that were analyzed, ACCS graduates responded very differently, in a good way, when compared with the other 5 school segments. In the first graph, we see a summary of the responses that are grouped into 7 life outcome profiles. The scale of this graph is from -30 to +50, and the bars indicate the percent of that group who answered above the median. So if a group had 50% responding below the median and 50% responding above the median, they would be displayed at the 0 mark. So when we look at this graph, I'm going to highlight a few items. In the area of college and career preparedness, ACCS had the best marks, with nearly 80% of ACCS alumni scoring above the median. Private preparatory schools earned the second highest marks, with approximately 65% of their graduates above the median. When we consider graduates' outlook on life, again, ACCS has the highest marks, with 60% above the median. In second place, we see that Christian home schools and evangelical Christian schools both had around 60% of their alumni above the median. And then finally, one more note on this graph. When we consider the cumulative marks in the area of influence, we see that Christian classically educated alumni are by far the most influential group, with ACCS alum scoring more than 80% above the median. The only other group who had an overall score above the median was private preparatory schools. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a deeper dive into each of these 7 outcome profiles to see how respondents answered and see how their lives reflect their education. As we move through the presentation, you are going to see data represented in blue and red bars. Blue bars indicate that you are looking at the raw response scores, while red bars indicate the responses which can be attributed to the impact of the school isolated from other factors. This is accomplished through the use of linear regression analysis, which removes factors like income, church attendance, parents' marital status, and other things like that. In addition, the order of schools displayed on this slide will remain the same throughout much of the presentation unless otherwise noted, moving from left to right, from public to classical Christian. So in the area of college and career preparation, we can see that ACCS grads, by a significant margin, earn the most A's and the most degrees in college. One thing that's interesting to note from these graphs is that the group with the second highest percentage of A's, religious homeschoolers, have the lowest percent of graduates earning a college or advanced degree. In considering whether they were prepared for their job, ACCS alumni are the most prepared, followed closely by private preparatory school alumni. It is important to note that the graph is showing you the adjusted results, isolating the impact to just the school alone. The actual raw score was much higher for all schools represented. It is also important to note the difference in the results when comparing classical Christian alumni to other evangelical Christian schools or religious homeschooling. As we move ahead into life outlook, one of the most important concerns that parents have for their children is what kind of life are they going to have, and how are they, the children, going to view that life? This profile is where we will take the most time and review the most data, because it is the broadest profile measurement on the quality of life that our alumni will have. The life outlook is measured in the survey by examining alumni in the areas of thankfulness, their trust in people, their level of self-sufficiency, asking whether or not they are goal-oriented, and examining their view of suffering, among other things. When we look at the overall composite score on life outlook, ACCS students significantly outperform the other groups, with more than 73% of ACCS alumni above the median. We see that ACCS alumni are the most likely to agree that suffering is a part of God's plan. ACCS alumni have a clear sense of purpose and direction in life, with only 14% reporting a lack of those goals and direction. Here, we see that classical Christian alumni do not view themselves as helpless. They're ready for the challenges that lie ahead. And in perhaps one of the most revealing statistics that came out of the study, we see that classical Christian alumni are the most thankful. And we know that thankfulness can be directly correlated with one's happiness in life. Next, we see that classical Christian alumni are the most likely to trust the people around them. And finally, we see that classical Christian alumni have a higher number of close friends. The median number of close friends across all the groups studied was 3. The average respondent said that they had 3 close friends. But when it came to classical Christian alumni, 90% answered that they had more than 3 close friends. And not only did they respond that they had more close friends, but they also reported interacting with those friends on a more frequent basis. As we move ahead to Christian commitment, one of the things that's very important to those of us who are Christian parents is knowing that when our children grow up, are they going to hold on to the Christian faith that we are seeking to instill in them? Christian commitment on this survey was measured by examining a number of factors, including church attendance, engagement in small group activities, regular Bible reading, volunteering at church, giving to church, and respondents' obligation to participate in religious practices, among other things. When combining these metrics into a composite result, we see that classical Christian alumni demonstrate the highest levels of Christian commitment out of any group. Overall, more than 90% of classical Christian alumni scored above the median result. Classical Christian alumni also reported the highest rates of reading religious literature outside of the Bible. And although they were more likely to express doubts about their religious beliefs than their evangelical and religious homeschool counterparts, they reported a higher level of commitment to practicing and supporting their churches, as well as a higher frequency of reading scripture and praying. When we move on to the Christian life profile, this profile captures the lifestyle differences of alumni and are a reflection of the beliefs that we just witnessed in the profile on Christian commitment. So this profile, Christian life, is a measure of, are they actually living out their faith? And here we see that classical Christian graduates are more likely to exceed the median in the number of volunteer hours than any other group. In this study, the median amount of volunteer time was 1 hour per month. More than 70% of ACCS grads exceeded that amount. Christian classically educated graduates were also more likely to live out their faith in their home. And this is evidenced here, where we see that ACCS grads were more likely to speak openly about God in the home and more likely to have a child enrolled in religious school. And finally, one of the ways that Christian living can be measured is by examining the graduates' views on marriage, divorce, and on their views on living together outside of marriage. Here we see that ACCS grads are very similar to evangelical and Christian religious homeschool groups in their view on cohabitation and in the area of divorce. Classical Christian grads are most likely to view it as morally wrong. But when we look at the actual perspectives that graduates hold on their own marriages, we see that there is little difference among any group in the level of marital satisfaction reported among the different school groups. But there is a big difference in the actual divorce rates that we see. This would also be true of evangelical Christian school alumni. Moving to the next life profile, we are going to look at, do the alumni hold traditional and conservative views? This survey did not contain significant political questions, so these results are driven more by social issues than political ones. And what we see is that Christian education showed strength in impacting the views of its students in a conservative and traditional way. We do not have time to review all of the statistics in this category, but classical Christian graduates were the most likely to believe that the Bible is an infallible guide and the least likely to believe that it contains errors. Moving on, we see that there is a sharp contrast between Christian education environments and the Catholic and secular environments that were compared. Not only is there a significant difference in the results overall, but when we isolate for the impact of the schools, the significant difference remains. This indicates that Christian schools tend to attract more traditional and conservative families, but they also reinforce those traditional and conservative values. In asking respondents for their views on authority and its role in the problems we face in our country, the various groups had relatively similar answers. Lack of authority was not viewed as a significant problem. But when asked specifically if the federal government should do more, there is a sharp contrast between religious school groups and Catholic or secular school groups. When considering perspective on premarital sex and homosexual marriage, there is again a sharp contrast between the Protestant Christian homeschooling and homeschooling as compared to the Catholic and secular schooling, and then an additional difference when we look at classical Christian schooling. It is important to remember this statistic and this slide in a few moments when we get to independent thinkers. So we see that when it comes to thinking independently, classical Christian alumni are the most likely to do so. It is important to consider multiple statistics side by side in order to get a good analysis and understanding of the data that we're looking at. Let's take a look at these individuals' ability to think independently. Generally speaking, there is an inverse relationship regarding a person's views on LGBT community and their ability to know one. That inverse relationship, though, does not hold true for classical Christian students. Generally, the higher the likelihood of someone believing gay marriage is wrong is a direct predictor of their chances of knowing an LGBT person. But this is not true for classical Christian school graduates. In addition, ACCS alumni trust scientists at about the same level as their secular educated counterparts and much more than their evangelical counterparts. And they believe science and religion are mostly compatible by a wide margin, unlike their evangelical counterparts. But even more so than their evangelical counterparts, they do not believe that the Bible has errors regarding science or history. And as we think about the area of tolerance, a major topic in our society today, here there is an attitude difference. Classical Christian alumni are the most likely of evangelically educated students to be tolerant of other non-Christian religions, about the same rate as private and secular schools. At the same time, though, they are the least likely to believe that religion is a private matter and should be kept out of social and political circles. And finally, classical Christian graduates are the most tolerant group of offensive things being said in public to religious groups. Moving ahead to the final profile, and perhaps the most significant profile we're going to look at, is influence. The differences for classical Christian alumni is most pronounced in this area. This profile measured how successful alumni are at engaging with their culture and society, and then how likely they were to influence it. Specific metrics that were included in this composite were: do they know a CEO? Do they know a politician or community leader? Do they volunteer outside of their church? Are they obliged to take action when wrong or injustice occurs? Do they believe that they can impact the world? Do they think that it's okay to be offended in public discourse? And does their pay dictate their vocational choice? So let's run through several data points in this metric. Classical Christian alumni are the most likely to be above the median when it comes to being involved in organizations outside of church. This means that classical Christian graduates, on average, will have wider circles of influence. Classical Christian graduates are the most likely to report knowing someone who is an atheist. Classical Christian graduates are the most likely to report a willingness to protest. At the same time, they report the highest levels of being willing to take action against wrong or injustice. Classical Christian graduates are the most likely to believe that they can impact their community, and they are the most likely to report knowing an influential person. Whew. So that was a lot of data in a short amount of time. But in conclusion, we can see that there is a significant difference between the various types of educational backgrounds that students come from. And so now I want to transition into some analysis of these metrics to unpack the why of how classical Christian education achieves some of the results that we just looked at. In order to do so, I'd like to start by going up and taking a 30,000-foot view of what is at the heart of classical Christian education. As Christian parents, we are called by God to raise our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Paul gives us this charge in Ephesians, the 6th chapter, when he says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord." In this passage, fathers can also be translated as parents. And the Greek word that the NIV translates to training and instruction is the word paideia. Unfortunately for us, our modern language does not have words that carry extensive meaning of a word like paideia. So what is this paideia, and what is the result of raising up our children in the paideia of the Lord? Paideia is about the cultivation of virtues and a high appreciation of truth, goodness, and beauty in the souls of our kids. Classical Christian education's objective is to shape virtues and sharpen the reason of our students so that they are in line with God's will. Many of the ideas behind classical Christian schools are foreign to modern educators. The model's transformative power lies in one truth: Christ is Lord of all. So what does that mean for how we live, how we think about things, what we value, and what we love? Put another way, education is about soul formation and not information. And this soul formation is what builds a culture. When carefully considered, a foundation this big transforms every aspect of a school and ultimately a person. Phil Bassett, a classical Christian humanities teacher in Texas, presented the idea this way: what are we preparing our student for? Are we preparing them for a job at a corporation? Is that what life is? Or are you preparing them to meet their maker? The foundation matters a lot. Now I'd like to provide some specific theories for you on why we saw some of the results that we did in the survey. Because of time, I don't have adequate time to go through and unpack every aspect of it, but we're going to touch on some of the ones that I think you will find to be most important. So going back from the beginning and starting in the area of college and career preparedness, the survey results are in line with data that we have seen from the ACCS schools for many years. When viewed on a national level, ACCS schools have consistently earned the top SAT results for many years. But the question that we're wanting to answer is why? Why do ACCS schools do so well academically? I'd like to give you three possible keys to the success that we find in classical Christian schools. And those are, first, the academic rigor that we hold to. Secondly, I'd like to suggest that we in classical Christian education have structured our schools to match the developmentally appropriate stages that children go through. And third and finally, we have a high emphasis on teaching our students how to think critically. Classical Christian education is a rigorous and disciplined education. We set a high bar for our students. Excellent education requires discipline and etiquette and order. And these items are manifest in many different ways at classical Christian schools. For example, grammar school students are taught and then required to walk in straight and quiet lines through the hallways. Students wear uniforms. Children are taught the proper way to shake hands and to greet one another. Respect for teachers, adults, and authority is emphasized, with habits such as thanking teachers at the end of every class or standing when an adult enters the room. The classical Christian model is also built upon a trajectory that matches the natural development of our children. You may often hear this referred to as the trivium, or the 3 stages of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. What this means, though, simply put, is that we aim to structure our teaching to align with the natural tendencies that we see as children grow. When they are young and eating up facts and data, we go heavy on that. This stage is called the grammar stage. When they are in the middle school years and they are eager to argue, we teach them how to think logically so that they get better at their arguments. And when they are older and in their high school years and they want so badly to be understood and to be heard, we teach them rhetoric so that they can articulate themselves in a winsome way. And third and finally, and perhaps most importantly, we teach our children to think critically. Our schools are not just rote memorization and fact, although we do some of that. Nor are we simply trusting our education to a single source, such as a textbook, for information. Classical schools teach from primary sources, often using multiple sources, which may not necessarily agree. On tours, I often give the example of when our students study the founding of America and our Constitution. Rather than reading from some modern textbook, our students will read the actual arguments that were purported by Jefferson and Madison and Adams and Hamilton, the arguments that are found in the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. Our students wrestle with those ideas and those arguments, trying to determine why it is we ended up with the Constitution that we have. And we follow this same idea and concept throughout all areas of our educational approach. In addition, the classical method employs methods such as Socratic discussion, which force our students to consider multiple points of view and wrestle through them in order to find truth. And when you take these 3 ideas and you put them on top of a foundation in Christ, they produce excellent results. As I mentioned previously, I believe that perhaps life outlook may be the one profile that parents are most interested in, and it should be. Our country and our Western culture is facing a crisis of satisfaction in life. We see that young people are in a major battle and struggle against suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism. In the US, life expectancy is now on decline for the first time. There are few very important factors that set Christian education, and in particular, classical Christian education, apart from our counterparts in the secular setting. First is how we answer the question of suffering. The humanist perspective that is offered in a secular education falls miserably short in providing our students and our children with why suffering and evil exists. Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most influential philosophers of the 19th century, whose work still resounds with us today, said, "No one can construct for you the bridge upon which precisely you must cross the stream of life. No one but you yourself alone." Another influential 19th century philosopher, Leo Tolstoy, said, it this way: the only absolute knowledge attainable by man is that life is meaningless. These ideas, promoted by men like Nietzsche and Tolstoy, are the theology of public and secularized educational systems, humanism and atheism. And to whatever extent evangelical schools model themselves after the public and secular systems, they too will inadvertently weave some of these same ideas into their own education. Conversely, Christian education, when done correctly, is built upon the foundation that Christ is Lord of all. And that teaching, that truth, teaches us that Christ is also Lord over suffering. In Romans chapter 8, we find the Christian theology on suffering. We are given assurance that the suffering is temporary, that God is in control, and that there is, in fact, a grand cause and a purpose for suffering. And we are left with the hope that God will work it out for our good. This is an incredible contrast, and one that provides true and lasting hope to the sons and daughters of the Most High. On the matter of giving, our students' sense of purpose and direction, the ACCS schools give them perspective on life through the study of theology and philosophy and history and literature, with a wide-ranging exposure to the Western canon. We teach them to love the Lord with all their minds, souls, and strength throughout every subject. We believe that this perspective shows up when alumni think about their significance in the grand scheme of things. Similarly, classical Christian alumni reported having the most confidence in dealing with life's problems. Why is that? Well, I would point you to an incredible presentation and idea about grit that was put forth by a woman named Angela Duckworth. You can look her up later. There are many factors that instill grit into our kids, and classical Christian schools deliver them well. Whether that is our commitment to teaching our kids that they are all made in the glory of God, or the rigorous academics that we call them to, or perhaps it is the mindset that is infused into our schools that they can be good at all subjects, that they are not just destined to be good at math or be good at English, that they can excel in both. The last idea and theory that I'd like to propose to you in this impact on life outcome, life outlook, is the idea of trust. We saw in the data that classical Christian school graduates are more trusting of people than any other school type. In addition, when compared to the evangelical Christian groups, classical Christian graduates are the most trusting of science, of government, and of institutions. The impact of leading a more trusting life is a greater level of happiness and contentment. According to a psychology study that was published in The Atlantic in March 2014, there is a direct and indisputable connection between higher levels of generalized trust and higher levels of happiness and intelligence. I believe that the greater levels of trust that we see in classical Christian graduates can be traced back to two main tenets. And these are those two tenets. The first is the Imago Dei. This idea comes from the first chapter of Genesis in verse 27, which reads, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." When we teach our students this idea of the Imago Dei, we are teaching them to see the glory of God in each and every person. And if we truly came into a full and complete understanding that every person is made in the image of God, we would be more likely to trust them and more likely to love them. And I would suggest that as we can see in our own society right now, we need a lot more of that. The second idea that we find, the second tenet that we find in classical Christian education is that all truth is God's truth. This idea was first taught by St. Augustine and then later was echoed by Sir Thomas Aquinas. These two massive figures are taught in just about every classical Christian school in the world. And the idea that truth belongs to God is incredibly important, because if we accept and trust that all truth is God's truth, then we don't have to live in fear. And you see, when we don't live in fear, we are able to trust more fully and more deeply. When we rest in the security that truth belongs to God, we don't have to be scared of ideas. We can engage them, we can wrestle with them, and we can hold them up to the light of Scripture. And ultimately, we can have confidence that truth will prevail and that all of it belongs to our God and Creator. In moving ahead to examine the significant difference that classical Christian education makes when it comes to the areas of Christian life and commitment, there are three main theories that come to mind. The first is that classical Christian education does not seek to emulate the progressive model that we find in most public, private, preparatory, and parochial schools, and then just add Bible and chapel on top. No, instead, we are seeking to integrate Christianity and Christian worldview into each and every discipline. And furthermore, we are seeking to integrate these studies into one another, to bring our education for our kids into a holistic manner. When we do that, students learn better. They learn more joyfully. They learn more fully. And they learn that their Christianity is not something that they leave at the door of the church, that they are to take it with them into the workplace, into the community, and into the home. The second theory, which I would like to offer to you as to why classical Christian education produces such astounding results in Christian life and commitment, is that our students are sitting at the feet of the best teachers, philosophers, and theologians of the past 3,000 years. We read the works of men like Aquinas and Augustine and Luther. Our children are taught that they are following in this tremendous line of great men and women who have gone before, committed to Christ. We study the martyrs of the church. This comprehensive view of Christianity is powerful and winsome. The third and final theory that I would suggest as to why classical Christian education rises above all else in the area of Christian life and commitment is that we are not afraid to push back on the idea of relativism. In 2016, Oxford Dictionaries released their annual Word of the Year award. The winner? Post-truth. Undoubtedly, this was mostly a result of the highly charged political climate that year. We had Brexit in Europe, and we had Donald Trump and fake news in America. But I can't help but notice that the reality of living in a post-truth world is one where objective facts take a back seat and feelings and emotions reign supreme. Another quote from Nietzsche, if you will. You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the correct way, and the only way, it does not exist. As classical Christian educators, we believe that there is objective truth, that there are ultimate laws and rules, and we believe that those are established by God. By arming and equipping our students to recognize that truth exists and that it does not change based on our feelings, we are preparing them to enter into a post-truth culture. One final thought for you on this idea of classical Christian education being more influential and producing more independent students. And the reason why I believe that classical Christian education is superior in these last two areas is because we do not shy away from engaging views that conflict with our own. Instead, we wrestle with them. I'll give you one example. I have shared multiple quotes this evening from Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a post-Enlightenment philosopher and writer in the 19th century. He is perhaps most famous for the idea that God is dead. He argued that the Enlightenment had killed the idea of God and that humanity no longer needed to believe in God. In classical Christian education, we read authors like Nietzsche, like Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx. At Coventry, our seniors read Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto and Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. We study evolutionary theory. We do this because we don't want to box with grandma. The idea is this: if you want to become a great boxer, you would not box your grandmother in training. Why? Because she is physically weak and frail, easy to beat. No, instead, if you want to become a great boxer, you're going to seek out someone that is stronger, quicker, and more experienced than yourself. And in so doing, you will be forced to improve your boxing skills. In classical Christian schools, we introduce our students to the greatest thinkers and the strongest arguments from the opposing side, so that they will be forced to wrestle with them under the caring, loving, and godly influence of Christian educators. In concluding my remarks on why classical, I would like to pose a question to you. What do Jesus Christ and Charles F. Potter have in common? It is very likely that I need to introduce you to Charles Potter. Potter was an author and a Unitarian minister who was a contemporary and friend of John Dewey. Dewey is often referred to as the father of American education. These men lived in the early 1900s. Jesus and Potter agree on little, but on one item they do. And that item is that education is vitally important in the formation of our children. In Luke, the 6th chapter, Jesus states, "The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher." In the early 1900s, Potter made this incredible declaration in support of the overhaul of our public education system. Potter said this: "What can theistic Sunday school, meeting for an hour per week, do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching?" So, why classical? Students in a classical Christian school are more academically prepared, they are more likely to have traditional views and to think independently, and they are more influential than those from other school backgrounds. Now, finally, I'd like to talk to you a few moments about why Coventry. How does Coventry Christian Schools specifically match up with classical Christian education on a national level? Well, first, we are the only ACCS member school within a 25-mile radius of Pottstown. So you're kind of stuck with us. That's a joke. But in all seriousness, becoming a classical Christian school is something that we have been endeavoring to do for several years now. But becoming a classical Christian school is somewhat of a misnomer because our journey is never really finished. Part of the ideal of classical Christian education is that we should always be learning, we should always be improving. But having said that, there are definitive markers of classical Christian education done in an excellent way. Broadly speaking, I would suggest that Coventry is doing a very good job in our pursuit of classical Christian education, but we still have much work to do. And in thinking through how we are doing, I want to talk about three main areas of focus in every classical Christian school's journey. The first and the most important is in the area of faculty. When Coventry Christian Schools decided to become classical in nature a little more than 10 years ago, none of our faculty had signed on for that journey. None of them were recruited to come to a classical Christian school. None of them had a classical Christian education themselves. But over the last 10 years, we have taken several steps in order to bolster the work that our teachers do in our classrooms. We have increased significantly our continuing education budget so that we can send our teachers to conferences and trainings and to visit other classical Christian schools where they can see and learn from those that have been doing it before us. We have expanded and improved our hiring processes. We now have a more extensive faculty application and a more extensive faculty training program than we've ever had before. 2 years ago, we introduced and funded classical university training for all of our K through 12 faculty and are working toward getting all of our teachers certified as classical Christian educators. It is critically important that as we continue to move forward, we continue to seek out the men and women who want and desire to teach our young people in a classical and Christian way. The second item that is critical to classical Christian school development is the curriculum. In talking about curriculum development, many things come to mind. We have made tremendous strides in the last decade at Coventry Christian Schools. Just about every piece of our K through 12 curriculum has been changed. We've introduced the Institutes for Excellence in Writing. We have implemented a primary source and great books approach to the teaching of humanities. We have integrated our humanities so that they're not taught in silos. We've added Latin. We now teach logic and rhetoric as formal courses of study. But as I mentioned, we still have much work to do. We need to continue to build out our formal curricular guides so that when we bring on new teachers, we equip them in the best possible way. We need to continue to pursue adding additional classical language in our high school program. And we are working to more thoroughly and excellently integrate our subjects with one another. The third and final item to every classical Christian school that matters in a significant way are the families and students inside the school. Some of the things that we've done here at Coventry Christian Schools is that over the past 5 years, we have completely overhauled our admissions program. We now require a family interview when students apply. We have become more selective, looking more closely at the former education that our students have received to see and try to ensure that the students we're bringing in want the type of education that we provide here at Coventry Christian Schools. So in considering we are doing a great job. Our students continue to stack up well. If you look at our website, you can see some of the individual data metrics that we provide, such as our SAT scores, which are significantly higher than national and state averages. But again, we're not done. We have much work to do. And so I want to conclude my remarks and thank you for coming this evening. I want to thank you for being a part of this webinar tonight. And I want to encourage you to consider joining us as we seek to implement a classical Christian education here in Pottstown. If you are a CCS parent, I would want to encourage you to continue to work with us, challenge us, push us to be better, share what's going on here with your neighbors and your friends. In the next 1 or 2 days, all of our current families are going to get this informational graphic that shares some of the details on how we're doing at Coventry Christian Schools. So when you get this, please take a few moments to look it over and then think about who out there would benefit and love what we're doing here at Coventry Christian Schools. If you are a CCS grandparent, and I was really impressed, we have dozens of CCS grandparents on the webinar this evening, please support your kids. They need your encouragement. They need your prayers. And if you are so blessed, I would encourage you, grandparents, support your children financially. Christian private schooling is not cheap. And if you have the means, I would encourage you to support your kids in providing this type of education to your grandchildren. And finally, to all of the prospective families that are with us on the call this evening, I want to encourage you to take seriously the decision that you have on who to choose as your educational partner. There may be no greater task for you as a parent than choosing how and where and with who you're going to educate your children. I hope that this webinar has been informative. Perhaps it has caused more questions than answers. That's a good thing. We love questions at a classical Christian school. And so if you have questions, I encourage you to reach out to us, ask those questions so that we can help you understand exactly what it is we're trying to accomplish here at CCS. So now